Chapter 1. The Crisis Looms. It was a foggy Tuesday morning in San Francisco, the kind where the mist clung to the skyscrapers like a shroud, mirroring the heaviness in Adrian Langston's chest. At just 28, Ari, as everyone called him, was the CEO of Langston Innovations, a tech startup that had once been the darling of Silicon Valley. Now, it was teetering on the edge of ruin. He stood in his sleek corner office, staring out at the gray city below, the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible through the haze. On his desk, a stack of financial reports glared back at him, red ink screaming losses from a failed AI project that had swallowed millions. Investors were bailing, banks were slamming doors, and the weight of it all was crushing him. Ari wasn't just fighting for his company, though. Langston Innovations wasn't his brainchild, it was his mother's. She'd built it from nothing, a single mom with a knack for coding and a dream of changing the world. Now, at 58, she was in the hospital, her heart failing under the stress of watching her legacy crumble. Ari had promised her he'd fix this, but every call he made, every meeting he took, ended in the same dead end. He was running out of time. The door creaked open behind him, and he turned to see Lauren Pierce stepping in. At 29, she was still the same free-spirited musician he'd fallen for 3 years ago. Wild blonde hair, a leather jacket slung over her shoulder, and those piercing green eyes that used to make his heart race. They'd broken up 6 months back when her touring life clashed with his startup grind, but she'd always had a way of showing up when he least expected it. "Ari, you look like hell," she said, her voice soft but edged with worry. She crossed the room and rested a hand on his arm. "What's going on?" He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his dark hair. "Everything's falling apart, Lauren. The company's bleeding money, Mom's in the hospital, and I've got no idea how to stop it." His voice cracked slightly, and he hated how vulnerable he sounded. Lauren frowned, her fingers tightening on his arm. "I wish I could help. You know I'd do anything for you." She meant it, he could tell, but what could she do? She was a singer scraping by on gig money, not a financial wizard. Still, having her there, even just for a moment, felt like a lifeline in the storm. "I appreciate it," he said quietly, forcing a small smile, "but unless you've got a spare $50 million lying around, I'm not sure there's much anyone can do." She sighed, pulling him into a quick hug. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Her words were warm, but they didn't reach the cold pit in his stomach. As she left, promising to check in later, Ari turned back to the window. He wanted to believe her, but the truth was staring him in the face. He was out of moves. Little did he know, a call was about to come that would change everything and drag him into a deal he never saw coming. Chapter 2. Sophie's Offer. The next day, Ari was still reeling from the mess of his life when his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Normally, he'd let it go to voicemail, but something told him to pick up. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was just dumb luck. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, exhaustion seeping through. "Adrian Langston?" The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, and oddly familiar. "It's Sophia Harrington. Sophie, from Lincoln High. Remember me?" Ari blinked, his brain scrambling to place the name. Lincoln High. His old school back in the Bay Area suburbs. Then it hit him. Sophia Harrington, the quiet girl with sharp eyes and a knack for winning every debate. She'd been in his chemistry class, always scribbling in her notebook while he goofed off with his buddies. Back then, she'd been all braces and ambition. Now, at 32, she was a name he'd seen in Forbes, a powerhouse venture capitalist who'd turned startups into gold mines. "Sophie, yeah, wow, it's been a while," he managed, leaning back in his chair. "How'd you get my number?" She laughed, a low, easy sound. "I've got my ways. Look, I'm not calling to catch up, though we could sometime. I heard about Langston Innovations. Rough spot, huh?" Ari's stomach tightened. Great, even high school acquaintances knew he was drowning. "Yeah, you could say that. What's this about?" "I've got a proposal," she said, her tone shifting to business. "I'm willing to invest $50 million into your company. Full bailout, no strings." Well, almost no strings. He sat up straighter, heart thudding. $50 million? That was enough to pull Langston Innovations out of the fire, pay off debts, and get them back on track. "What's the catch?" he asked, because there was always a catch. A pause, then she dropped it. "Marry me, 18 months. That's the deal." Ari nearly choked on his own breath. "Wait, what? Marry you? Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Sophie replied, unflinched. "I'm pitching to some old-school investors in Asia next quarter. They're obsessed with stability, family values, all that jazz. A wife looks good on paper, but a husband? That's a power move. It's PR, Ari. You help me seal this deal, I save your company. Win-win." "Your picks are the—" His mind raced. Marriage? He hadn't even thought about dating since Lauren, let alone tying the knot with someone he barely remembered. But 50 million, that was his mother's dream, his promise to her, dangling right there. "Why me?" he asked, voice quieter now. "You could pick anyone." Another pause, softer this time. "Let's just say I've kept an eye on you over the years. You're smart, you're driven, and, honestly, I trust you. So, what do you say?" Ari's throat felt dry. He thought of Lauren, her wild laugh, her songs, the way she'd held him yesterday. He still loved her, didn't he? But then he pictured his mom in that hospital bed, the red ink on those reports, the employees counting on him. He squeezed his eyes shut, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I need to think about it." "Fair enough," Sophie said. "You've got until tomorrow night. Meet me at the Cliff House, 7 p.m. We'll talk details. Don't ghost me, Ari. I'm not the type to chase." The call ended, and Ari stared at the phone, his world tilting. A contract marriage? It sounded insane, like something out of a bad rom-com, but as he sat there, the fog outside thinning just enough to show a sliver of sunlight, he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be his only shot. And somewhere deep down, a tiny voice wondered what Sophia Harrington was really after, and why, after all these years, she'd chosen him. Chapter 3. A Marriage of Convenience. The wedding happened faster than Ari could wrap his head around. 2 weeks after that phone call, he found himself standing in a vineyard at a sprawling Napa Valley estate, surrounded by rolling hills and the faint scent of grapes. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over everything, but it didn't warm the knot in his stomach. He tugged at the collar of his black tux, feeling more like a prop than a groom. Across from him stood Sophia Harrington. Sophie looking every bit the powerhouse she was. Her cream-colored gown hugged her frame, simple but elegant, and her dark hair was swept up in a way that made her look untouchable. At 32, she'd grown into someone striking, her quiet teenage awkwardness replaced by a calm, unshakable confidence. The ceremony was small, just a handful of Sophie's business contacts and a justice of the peace. No family, no friends, no fuss. Ari had told his mom he was sorting things out for the company, sparing her the details. She didn't need more stress. As the officiant droned on about vows and unity, Ari's mind wandered to Lauren. He hadn't told her either, just a vague text about being busy. Guilt gnawed at him, but what could he say? "Hey, I'm marrying someone else to save my company, but don't worry, it's fake?" Yeah, that'd go over well. "Do you, Adrian Langston, take Sophia Harrington to be your wife?" The words snapped him back. Sophie's eyes met his, steady and unreadable. He swallowed hard. "I do," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Her turn came, and she answered without a flicker of hesitation. "I do." Rings slid onto fingers, hers warm against his clammy skin, and just like that, they were married. A smattering of polite applause followed, and Sophie leaned in, brushing a quick, perfunctory kiss on his cheek. It was over in 10 minutes. That night, they moved into her penthouse in San Francisco, a sleek, modern place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. Ari had his own room down the hall, a silent agreement that this wasn't that kind of marriage. Sophie made it clear from the start, no expectations, no strings beyond the deal. "We're partners, Ari," she'd said. But living with her wasn't what he'd expected. She wasn't cold or distant, just careful. Every morning he'd stumble into the kitchen to find a mug of tea waiting, steeped just long enough like she'd timed it. "You look like you need it," she'd say with a half smile, then disappear into her office. when the press got wind of their marriage and started hounding him, calling him a gold digger, a sellout. She stepped in. One afternoon outside Langston Innovations, cameras swarmed him, questions flying like bullets. "Did you marry her for the money, Adrian? Is this a sham?" He froze, words failing him, until Sophie appeared at his side. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She slipped her hand into his, firm and steady, and faced the reporters. "My husband's private life isn't your story. Back off." They did. Nobody messed with Sophia Harrington. In the car after, he muttered, "You didn't have to do that." She glanced at him, her hazel eyes softening for a split second. "Yeah, I did. You're with me now. They don't get to tear you apart." Then she looked away like it was nothing. Ari didn't know what to make of her. She was all business, sharp suits, late-night calls with investors, but there were these moments, small and quiet, that threw him off. A blanket left on the couch when he fell asleep there. A takeout order with his favorite spicy noodles when he'd had a rough day. No explanation given. He told himself it was just her being decent, nothing more. But late at night, staring out at the city lights from his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie saw him in a way he wasn't used to, maybe in a way Lauren never had, and that scared him more than he'd admit. Chapter 4. Lauren's Return. 3 months into the marriage, Ari was starting to find a rhythm. Langston Innovations was stabilizing, Sophie's $50 million had worked wonders, and his mom was finally out of the hospital, asking fewer questions than he'd feared. He and Sophie had settled into a weird kind of normal. Shared breakfasts, polite small talk, the occasional late-night chat over wine when neither could sleep. He wasn't sure if they were friends, exactly, but he didn't hate having her around. That was until Lauren crashed back into his life like a hurricane. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Ari was in the middle of a meeting at Langston Innovations. The conference room buzzed with energy, his team pitching a new AI prototype to a handful of investors. He was mid-sentence, gesturing at a sleek hologram, when the double doors flew open with a bang. Heads turned, and there she was, Lauren Pierce. All fire and fury, her blonde hair wild and her leather jacket slung low. She didn't wait for an invitation, just marched right in, green eyes blazing. "Adrian Langston, you owe me an explanation," she snapped, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The investors shifted awkwardly, a few coughing into their hands. Ari's stomach dropped. "Lauren, what are you—" he started, but she didn't let him finish. She stormed up to the table, planting her hands on it, leaning in so close he could smell the faint patchouli on her. "I get back from tour and everyone's talking about how you're married to Sophia freaking Harrington. What the hell, Ari?" Her voice cracked, raw and ragged, and for a second he saw the hurt behind the anger. His team stared, wide-eyed. One guy even pulled out his phone like he was about to record this train wreck. Ari stood, hands raised like he could calm her down. "Lauren, this isn't the place. Can we—" "No," she cut him off, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You don't get to dodge this. We were together for 2 years and you just— What, marry some rich chick without even telling me?" Her words hit hard and guilt twisted in his gut. He hadn't meant to blindside her. He just avoided the conversation. Classic Ari. He glanced around, the room a mix of shock and second-hand embarrassment. "Let's talk outside," he said, keeping his voice low, firm. She glared but finally nodded, stomping out, with him trailing behind. The hallway was quieter, but the tension followed them like a shadow. Lauren crossed her arms, pacing a tight circle. "Tell me the truth, Ari. Is this real, or did she buy you?" He flinched. "It's complicated. The company was tanking. Sophie offered to invest, but it came with a condition. 18 months of marriage. It's a deal, Lauren. That's it." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. "A deal? So you're not in love with her?" "No," he said quickly, maybe too quickly. "It's just business." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt off. Sophie's tea in the mornings, her hand in his when the press swarmed. Those didn't feel like just business. He shook it off, focusing on Lauren. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how. I'm sorry." She let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through her hair. "Sorry doesn't cut it. I thought we had something, Ari. I thought you'd fight for us." Her voice softened, and she stepped closer, her fingers brushing his wrist. "Do you still love me?" He froze. Did he? He'd loved her once. her chaos, her passion, the way she'd made him feel alive. But now, standing there, he couldn't answer. Before he could find the words, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He turned, and there was Sophie, standing by the office door. She'd heard everything. Her face was calm, but her hazel eyes were unreadable, a storm brewing behind them. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. Ari's chest tightened. Lauren was still waiting for an answer, her hand on his, but all he could think about was Sophie, and why her silence stung more than Lauren's shouting ever could. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Facade. The days after Lauren's outburst felt different, like a thread had snapped somewhere in the careful balance Ari and Sophie had built. The penthouse was still the same, shiny floors, city views, the faint hum of the espresso machine, but the air had shifted. Sophie didn't say a word about what she'd overheard in the hallway, didn't bring up Lauren or the mess at the office. She just kept going, leaving tea out for him, nodding politely over breakfast, her usual steady self. But something was off. She wasn't cold, exactly, just distant. No more late-night chats over wine, no more half smiles when he rambled about work. It was like she'd pulled back a layer of herself he hadn't even realized he'd gotten used to. Ari noticed it most in the little things. She stopped lingering in the kitchen after dinner, heading straight to her office instead. When they passed in the hall, her good morning was clipped, her eyes barely meeting his. He told himself it didn't matter. This was a deal, not a real marriage, but the quiet gnawed at him. He'd catch himself wondering what she was thinking, why she wouldn't just call him out on it. Sophie wasn't the type to play games. So why the wall? One night, about a week after the Lauren blow-up, he found her on the penthouse balcony. It was late, the city lights glittering below like a sea of stars, and she was leaning against the railing, a glass of red wine in her hand. Her dark hair fluttered in the breeze, and for once, she wasn't in her usual power suit, just a loose sweater and jeans. She looked softer, smaller somehow, but her shoulders were tense. Ari hesitated in the doorway, then stepped out. "Hey," he said, keeping it light. "Couldn't sleep either?" She glanced over, her hazel eyes catching the light for a second before she turned back to the view. "Something like that." Her voice was neutral, but there was an edge to it, a crack he couldn't ignore. He moved closer, leaning on the railing beside her. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" Sophie took a slow sip of her wine, letting the question hang there. When she finally spoke, her tone was careful, measured. "I'm fine, Ari, just busy." It was a dodge, and they both knew it. He frowned, shifting to face her. "Come on, Sophie. If something's up, just say it. I can handle it." She let out a small, dry laugh, setting her glass down on the ledge. "What's there to say?" "You've got your life, I've got mine. We're sticking to the plan, right?" But her eyes flicked to his, and there it was. Something raw, unguarded, gone as fast as it came. He didn't know why it hit him so hard, but it did. "Is this about Lauren?" he asked, quieter now. "What you heard the other day?" Sophie didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened around the railing. "I don't care who you love, Ari," she said, her voice steady but low. "That's not part of the deal. If you want to go back to her when this is over, that's your call. I'm not here to hold you back." Her words were calm, practical, but they landed like a punch. He opened his mouth to argue, though he wasn't sure what he'd say, but she kept going. "If you want out early, just tell me. I'll still fund the company, no hard feelings." She looked at him then, full on, and it was the saddest he'd ever seen her. "If that's what you want, I won't keep you here." Ari stared at her, his mind a tangle. He should have said yes, should have taken the out, run back to Lauren, to the life he'd known. But standing there, the cool night air biting at his skin, he couldn't. The thought of walking away from this, from her, felt wrong, like losing something he hadn't even named yet. "I don't want out," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, picking up her glass. "Okay," was all she said before heading inside, leaving him alone with the city and a mess of feelings he didn't know how to sort. He stayed out there until the chill sank into his bones, wondering why her distance hurt more than Lauren's chaos ever had, and why, for the first time, He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Chapter 6. The Departure. 18 months felt like a lifetime and a blink all at once. By the time the contract's end loomed, Ari barely recognized the man he'd been when it started. Langston Innovations was thriving, new projects in the pipeline, investors back on board, his mom smiling again from her cozy house in Marin County. Sophie had kept her word. The $50 million had saved everything. But as the final weeks ticked down, Ari couldn't shake the restless ache in his chest. The penthouse, with its polished surfaces and quiet routines, had become a strange kind of home. And Sophie, well, she'd become something he couldn't quite define. He'd stopped lying to himself about Lauren months ago. Her calls had tapered off, her texts gone unanswered, not because he was mad, but because he didn't feel the pull anymore. She'd always been a wildfire, bright and thrilling, but Sophie was different, steady, real. The way she'd sit with him through late-night brainstorming sessions or leave a note with his tea when she left early. "Don't burn out, Ari." It wasn't loud, but it stuck with him. He didn't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line, he'd started looking forward to her being there. So when the end came, he should have been relieved. The deal was done, his company safe, his freedom back. Instead, he felt trapped. Trapped by the idea of staying, trapped by the pull of going. One night, he found Sophie in the living room, flipping through a stack of papers, her glasses perched on her nose. She looked up, catching his stare. "Last week, huh?" she said, her voice light, but her eyes searching. "You must be counting the hours." He forced a smile, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, guess it's almost over." She nodded, setting the papers down. "You've done good, Ari. The company's solid. You should be proud." Then, softer, "What's next for you?" That was the question, wasn't it? He could stay in San Francisco, keep building Langston Innovations, maybe even keep Sophie in his life somehow, or he could chase Lauren again, see if that old spark was still there. He'd been texting her lately, just casual stuff, testing the waters, and she'd hinted at wanting him back. It'd be easy to fall into that, familiar. But standing there watching Sophie's quiet strength, he made a choice. "I think I need to figure some things out," he said, the words heavy. "With Lauren, see if there's still something there." Sophie didn't blink, didn't flinch. She just leaned back, crossing her arms. "Okay," she said simply. "If that's what you need, go for it." Her tone was even, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something like resignation. She stood, brushing past him toward her room. "Take care, Ari." That was it. No fight, no plea, just goodbye. The next morning, he packed a bag and left the penthouse, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made his chest ache. He didn't look back, couldn't. But as he drove across the Bay Bridge, he felt like he'd left more behind than he'd meant to. Weeks later, Sophie stood alone in that same penthouse, staring at the empty spot where Ari's coat used to hang. She'd known this day might come, had braced for it since the hallway with Lauren, but it didn't make it easier. She'd poured everything into this deal, into him, and now he was gone. She was fine, she told herself. She always was. Until one morning when the nausea hit and a little plastic stick showed 2 pink lines, pregnant. Ari's kid. Her hands shook as she held it, her mind racing. Tell him? No. He'd chosen Lauren, chosen his old life. She couldn't trap him, couldn't face the pity in his eyes if he thought she was clinging. So she didn't. She sold the penthouse, packed her life into boxes, and moved to Seattle. New city, new start. She'd raise this baby alone, she decided, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. She'd be enough. But late at night, when the rain tapped against her windows, she'd wonder if she'd made the right call, and if Ari would ever know what he'd left behind. Chapter 7. The Twist Unveiled. 6 years slipped by in a blur for Sophia Harrington. Seattle had become her refuge, a quiet corner of the world where she could rebuild away from the glitter and grind of San Francisco. At 38, she was still the same sharp-minded woman who'd turned startups into empires, but now she balanced that with raising Miles, her 5-year-old son with Ari's dark hair and her hazel eyes. He was her everything, a whirlwind of energy asking a million questions, dragging her to the park to chase squirrels. She'd made a life here, Consulting gigs, a cozy house with a view of Puget Sound, a handful of friends who didn't pry. But Ari was always there, a ghost in the corners of her mind, in the way Miles scrunched his nose just like his dad used to. She'd kept tabs on him over the years, not stalking, just checking. Langston Innovations had soared under his watch, popping up in tech headlines while she stayed out of the spotlight. She'd never told him about Miles. At first it was pride. She wouldn't beg him to come back. Then it was fear. What if he didn't want this? What if he hated her for keeping it secret? So she'd stayed silent, convincing herself it was better this way, until one rainy afternoon, when everything changed. Sophie was sipping tea at her kitchen table, Miles napping upstairs, when she scrolled through a news site on her tablet. A headline caught her eye. Adrian Langston funds $20 youth tech program in SF. There he was in the photo, older, sharper around the edges, but still the same Ari, with that half smile she'd never quite forgotten. Her chest tightened. 6 years, and he was still out there, building something good. She wondered if he was happy, if he'd stayed with Lauren, if he ever thought about her. Then, on impulse, she decided it was time. Miles deserved to know his father, and she couldn't keep running from the truth. She booked a flight to New York, where Ari was slated to speak at a tech conference. Miles stayed with a friend, too young for this trip, and Sophie spent the plane ride rehearsing what she'd say. "Hey Ari, funny story. You've got a son." "No, too flippant. I should have told you years ago." Too heavy. She'd figure it out when she saw him. But when she got to his office at the conference venue, he wasn't there. Off to Europe, they said. Disappointed, she lingered, chatting with an old colleague who'd worked with Langston Innovations back in the early days. That's when she saw it. A folder on the guy's desk labeled Confidential 2019 Breach. Curiosity tugged at her, and when he stepped out for coffee, she flipped it open. What she found stopped her cold. Emails, bank records, a timeline. Lauren Pierce had tried to sell Langston's AI prototype code to a rival firm 6 years ago, right when the company was tanking. She'd been drowning in gambling debts, casinos, bad bets, a whole secret life, and thought a quick payout would fix it. But the deal never went through. Why? Because Ari had caught wind, paid off her debts himself, and buried the whole thing. He'd saved his company and Sophie's investment without a word to anyone. Sophie's hands shook as she read. Lauren, the woman Ari had chosen over her, had betrayed him, and Ari, the man she'd walked away from, had protected her without even knowing it. She'd spent years thinking he'd picked chaos over her, but he'd been shielding her legacy, her trust, all along. The colleague came back, saw her with the folder and sighed. She left the office in a daze, the New York streets blurring around her. Lauren wasn't the free spirit she'd envied. She was a liar. And Ari wasn't the guy who'd walked away from her. He'd been the one holding everything together. Now, with Miles waiting back home, she felt the weight of her own mistake crash down. She'd kept his son from him, judged him wrong, and let 6 years slip away. The question was, could she fix it, or had she lost him for good? Chapter 8. Searching for Redemption. Sophie couldn't sit still after New York. The folder, the truth about Lauren, Ari's quiet sacrifice, it all churned inside her like a storm she couldn't outrun. She'd spent 6 years building a wall around her heart, telling herself she'd done the right thing by keeping Miles a secret. But now, knowing what Ari had done, saving her investment, her trust, without ever asking for credit, it cracked that wall wide open. He deserved to know about his son. She owed him that much, even if it meant facing his anger, his rejection, whatever came. So she decided to find him. Ari wasn't in New York anymore. His team said he'd jetted off to Europe for a string of charity events, something about tech education for kids. Typical Ari, she thought, always giving more than he took. She tracked him down to London, where he was due at a gala in a few days. No more waiting, no more excuses. She booked another flight, leaving Miles with her Seattle neighbor, a sweet older woman who adored him, and flew across the Atlantic. Her stomach in knots the whole way. She didn't know what she'd say when she saw him, but she'd figure it out. She had to. London was cold and gray when she landed, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones. The gala was at some fancy hotel in Mayfair, all chandeliers and tuxedos, the sort of place Sophie used to rule with a handshake and a smile. She slipped in with a borrowed invite from an old business contact, her black dress simple but sharp, her hair pulled back tight. She scanned the room. Tech moguls, philanthropists, a buzz of laughter and clinking glasses. Then she saw him. Ari stood near the bar, taller than she remembered, his dark hair flecked with a few early grays. He was laughing, that low, easy laugh she'd missed more than she'd ever admitted, talking to a woman in a sleek red gown. She was stunning, blonde, poised, leaning in close as she spoke. Sophie's breath caught. The woman touched his arm, and he smiled. A real smile, not the guarded one he used to wear around her. Her heart sank. Was this who he'd become? Had he moved on, found someone else while she'd been hiding in Seattle? She edged closer, catching snippets of their conversation. Something about a school project in Berlin, funding timelines. The woman was a colleague, maybe, but the way she looked at him felt like more. Sophie's resolve wavered. She'd come to tell him about Miles, to spill everything, but now doubt clawed at her. What if he didn't care? What if he'd built a new life, one without room for her or a son he didn't know existed? She lingered near a pillar, watching until Ari turned his head just enough to scan the room, and their eyes locked. For a split second, time stopped. His smile faltered, his brow creasing as recognition hit. Sophie froze, pinned by that look. Surprise, confusion, something deeper she couldn't name. He excused himself from the woman and started toward her, weaving through the crowd. Her pulse raced. This was it. But before he got halfway, she panicked. The weight of 6 years, the fear of what he'd say, it all crashed down. She turned and slipped out a side door, disappearing into the London night. Back at her hotel, she sat on the edge of the bed, head in her hands. She'd run. Again. She'd come all this way and she couldn't face him. The image of him with that woman burned in her mind. Maybe he had moved on. Maybe she was too late. But Miles, her sweet, curious Miles, kept her from giving up completely. She'd go home. Chapter 9, A Chance Encounter. 6 years had stretched the distance between Ari and Sophie into something vast, a chasm filled with silence and what-ifs. He'd thrown himself into work after she'd left. Langston Innovations became his world, a shield against the hollow ache she'd left behind. At 34, he was a tech titan, jetting between continents, funding projects that mattered. But the penthouse days with Sophie lingered like a song he couldn't forget. He'd never gone back to Lauren, not after she'd faded out of his life again, chasing her music and her chaos. He'd told himself he was fine alone, until a crisp fall day in San Francisco changed everything. Ari was back in the city for a rare break, walking through Golden Gate Park with a coffee in hand, the air sharp with the scent of eucalyptus. He'd been in Europe for months, London, Berlin, endless meetings, and the familiarity of home felt good, grounding. Kids ran past, laughing, leaves crunching underfoot, and he let himself relax, just for a moment. Then he saw her. Sophie was across the path, kneeling by a little boy with messy dark hair tying his shoe. She was older, softer around the edges, her dark hair loose and catching the sunlight. Ari stopped dead, his coffee nearly slipping from his grip. It was her. Unmistakably her. His heart thudded, a mix of shock and something warmer, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. She hadn't seen him yet, too focused on the kid, her voice gentle as she said, "There you go, Miles. No more tripping, okay?" Miles. The name hit him, but it was the boy's face that knocked the air out of him. Dark eyes, a familiar tilt to his jaw. Ari saw himself in that kid, clear as day. His mind raced, piecing it together. 5, maybe 6 years old. The timing. Sophie's sudden exit. It couldn't be, but it was. He knew it in his bones. He crossed the path before he could think twice, his voice rough when he spoke. "Sophie?" She looked up and her face went pale, eyes wide like she'd seen a ghost. "Ari," she breathed, standing slowly, one hand still on the boy's shoulder. Miles peered up at him, curious, unafraid, and Ari's chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe. "Hi," he said dumbly, because what else do you say after 6 years and a kid you didn't know you had? Sophie's mouth opened, then closed, like she was scrambling for words too. "Mommy, who's this?" Miles piped up, tugging at her sleeve, his big eyes darting between them. Sophie swallowed, her gaze locked on Ari's. "This is An old friend, she said, but her voice shook, and Ari knew she was stalling. He stepped closer, his coffee forgotten on a bench somewhere behind him. Is he mine? He asked, low and direct, cutting through the noise of the park. No point dancing around it. He saw the truth in her flinch, the way her hand tightened on Miles. She took a shaky breath, then nodded. Yeah, he's yours. The world tilted. Ari stared at her, then at Miles, who was now kicking at a leaf, oblivious to the bomb that just dropped. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked, anger and hurt spilling out despite his best effort to keep it together. I tried, she said, her eyes glistening now. After I left, I found out. I went to New York to tell you, then London. I saw you at that gala, with that woman. You looked happy. I thought you'd moved on, and I couldn't. She stopped, swallowing hard. I couldn't ruin that. Moved on? He laughed, sharp and bitter. Sophie, I haven't moved on from you in 6 damn years. That woman was a colleague, nothing else. You ran before I could even talk to you. He raked a hand through his hair, pacing a step. You kept my son from me because of a guess? Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I was scared, Ari. Scared you'd hate me, scared you didn't want this. I thought I was doing the right thing. He stopped, looking at her, really looking. The Sophie he'd known was still there, strong and stubborn, but broken too. And Miles, this little piece of them both, was staring up at him now, confused but unafraid. Ari knelt, meeting the boy's eyes. Hey, buddy, he said, softer. Miles grinned, shy. Hi. Do you like squirrels? Ari chuckled, the sound rough with emotion. Yeah, I do. He straightened, facing Sophie again. We need to talk. All of it. No more running. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Okay, no more running. Chapter 10. A Family Reunited. The park faded into the background as Ari and Sophie sat on a weathered bench, Miles scampering off a few feet away to chase a squirrel up a tree. The air was crisp, the late afternoon sun painting everything in soft gold, but the space between them crackled with 6 years of unspoken words. Ari couldn't stop glancing at Miles, his son, a living echo of himself he'd never known. It hurt, sharp and deep, but there was something else too, a quiet, fierce joy he hadn't expected. Sophie sat beside him, hands clasped tight in her lap, her eyes red but steady. She'd stopped crying, but the weight of her choices hung heavy in the silence. I don't know where to start, she said finally, her voice low. I messed up, Ari. I should have told you from the beginning. Yeah, you should have, he said, not sugarcoating it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. 6 years, Sophie. I missed his first steps, his first words, everything. You don't get how much that stings. She flinched but nodded. I do. I thought about calling you every day. Every time he laughed, every time he asked about his dad, it killed me. But I kept telling myself you were better off, happier without this, without me. He turned to her, frustration flaring. You don't get to decide that for me. I loved you, Sophie. Back then, in that penthouse, I was figuring it out. Slow, maybe, but it was real, and you walked away. Her breath hitched, and she looked at him, really looked like she was seeing him for the first time in years. Loved me? She whispered, almost like she didn't believe it. Yeah, he said, softer now. I didn't know how to say it then. I picked Lauren because she was safe, familiar. I was scared of what I felt with you, but it was you, always you. When you left, it broke me. Tears welled up again, but she blinked them back. I loved you too, she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't realize it until I was gone. And then Miles came and I thought I'd lost my chance. Ari let that sink in, the ache in his chest shifting into something warmer. He reached out, hesitant, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled into his like they belonged there. You didn't lose it, he said. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Miles ran back then, cheeks flushed, holding a leaf like a trophy. "Look, it's huge," he announced, climbing onto the bench between them. Ari laughed, ruffling his hair, and Sophie smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up her face. That night, they went to Sophie's place, a little house near the park, cozy and cluttered with Miles's toys. Ari stayed for dinner, then bedtime stories, watching Sophie tuck Miles in with a tenderness that made his heart twist. When the house was quiet, they sat on her porch, a blanket draped over their shoulders, the city humming softly below. "I want to do this right," Ari said, breaking the silence. "You, me, Miles, a family, no contracts, no deals, just us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You mean that?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he slid off the porch swing, knelt in front of her, and pulled a small box from his pocket. A ring he'd bought in London after that gala, on a whim he hadn't understood until now. "Sophia Harrington, will you marry me? For real this time?" She stared at the ring, then at him, a laugh bubbling up through her tears. "Yes," she said, pulling him up into a kiss that felt like coming home. A year later, they stood on a windswept beach in Marin County, Miles between them in a tiny suit, proudly handing over the rings. The wedding was small, just family, a few friends, the ocean crashing nearby. No investors, no press, just love, messy, hard-won, and true. They built a life after that, splitting time between San Francisco and Seattle, blending tech and charity, raising Miles with stories of how they'd found each other twice. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was more than enough.